In a quiet stretch of Lexington's suburban sprawl, beneath a sky that offered little comfort, a heinous joke was set in motion, one that would soon unravel with catastrophic consequences. The night was cool and unremarkable, its silence disturbed only by the soft hum of streetlights and the low murmur from a dispatch radio. Two officers, emboldened by a dangerous mix of arrogance and boredom, believed themselves untouchable. They sat near a flickering gas station sign, sharing smirks and half-hearted quips, as they received a call that promised nothing more than a mundane check on a suspicious person in a quiet neighborhood. Officers Greg and Tyler, names casually exchanged in whispered banter, exchanged a glance that said, "Another routine round." Greg, tossing aside a half-eaten sandwich that crunched onto the worn dashboard, murmured, "Bet it's nothing serious." Tyler's grin was mischievous, as though he anticipated a bit of fun rather than duty, while the dispatcher's measured tone revealed no hint of urgency. They sped off, the steady thrum of their cruiser punctuating a night that would soon erupt into chaos. Their journey led them down a narrow lane aptly named Bluegrass, where a silver sedan idled before a stately brick house, its dark windows holding secrets of their own. A solitary figure stood by the car, a woman clad in a crisp navy dress and low, clicking heels. One hand clutched her cell phone as if it were a lifeline, the other rested nonchalantly on the door. At first, her eyes remained locked on her device, absorbed in a private conversation, her dark, soulful eyes and short, playful curls betraying none of the apprehension that would soon come to define this night. The cruiser's headlights sliced through the darkness, bouncing off her car's glossy surface and startling her. In that moment, the officer's true intentions began to crystallize. Tyler leaned forward and said, as though confirming a mischief only he could sense, "Bingo." The woman's gaze flickered upward, a brief glimpse of confusion mingled with a dawning realization of impending danger. Before she could steady herself, Greg's authoritative voice caught through the quiet, "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" Her response came haltingly, as if rehearsed in distress. "My car, it broke down." "I'm waiting for a friend," she offered, lowering her phone and glancing nervously toward the darkened porch of the brick house. The officers exchanged a look that danced between skepticism and disdain. "And you live here?" Tyler asked, his tone laced with an unsettling familiarity that belied the simplicity of her explanation. With a nod and a vague mention of identification, the woman's uncertainty only deepened, a silence so pregnant with unspoken truths that it seemed to incite them. Then, without warning or further inquiry, the atmosphere shifted from mundane to menacing. Greg's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that belied the routine nature of their call. "You fit the description," he barked, his words sounding less like an accusation and more like the punchline to a cruel practical joke. Tyler, barely containing a chuckle, slipped handcuffs around her trembling wrists. The woman's eyes widened, her heart pounding as if trying to escape the confines of her ribcage. "Please!" "I didn't do anything wrong," she pleaded, her voice a brittle mix of fear and disbelief. But her protest was swallowed by the dark humor that had seized the two officers. They barked orders for her to turn around, and as she obeyed, they marched her to a nearby wooden utility pole. The rough rope, unyielding and coarse, bit into her skin with every shudder of movement. The sound of its scraping was drowned out by the officers' derisive laughter, a laughter that echoed through the silent street like a cruel refrain. "Bet you won't look so suspicious now," Tyler jeered, snapping a photo that captured every moment of her humiliation. In that dreadful instant, the night air turned from cool to cutting, as if it shared in her torment. The woman's pleas dissolved into stifled whimpers, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged bursts as she realized this was no lawful arrest but a demented game. The ropes were snug enough to restrict her, yet cruelly lenient, ensuring her suffering was both visible and, in the eyes of her tormentors, entertaining. The officers lingered, their laughter fading into a silence punctuated only by the soft beeping of their radios, a silence that betrayed no record of the atrocity they had just committed. Somewhere across the street, a lone figure had been watching. A man, partially concealed by the night's shadows and the silhouettes of parked cars, had witnessed the unfolding debacle. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, a silent communion of shock and sympathy. But when Tyler's voice sliced through the moment with a terse mind-your-own-business, the stranger's hope vanished. He took a step back, his presence dissolving into the darkness, leaving the victim's spirit hanging by a thread of desperate expectation. Eventually, the officers released her. With a careless flick of their eyes and a smirk that played at the edges of their lips, they allowed her to stagger away. Her wrists, red and raw, bore the cruel testament of their malice as she fumbled for her car keys. Her car, already sputtering in the cold, roared reluctantly to life, a fragile vessel of escape. Tyler, peering through the cruiser's open window, tossed a final barb over his shoulder, "Next time, don't stick around where you don't belong." And with that, they vanished into the night, leaving behind a scene that would haunt the darkness for hours to come. Dawn crept into the precinct with the stale aroma of coffee and the rustle of paperwork, mundane sounds that belied the storm simmering just below the surface. Greg lounged in his chair with a smug air, a paper cup discarded into the trash as if to punctuate his careless mirth. Whispers of the previous night's fun were exchanged with hollow laughter among the officers. Greg even boasted about the night's antics to a colleague, confident that no consequence would follow their juvenile misdeeds. That confidence shattered the moment the precinct door swung open with a heavy creak. In strode Detective Raymond Carter, a man whose mere presence seemed to recalibrate the very air of the room. Tall and immaculately attired in a suit pressed to perfection, his measured steps were as deliberate as a metronome's beat. As his eyes swept across the room, every officer felt an unspoken weight settle upon them, a weight that spoke of retribution and a long-overdue reckoning. Introductions were made with forced cordiality. Greg and Tyler greeted Carter with the customary, disingenuous pleasantries, a strained welcome aboard and a half-hearted handshake that belied their inner trepidation. Yet Carter's gaze was not one for idle chatter. His eyes locked onto a smartphone clutched in Greg's hand, and with a calm swipe, he revealed an image that halted the room's feigned levity, the damning photograph of the woman, now unmistakably humiliated, tied to a pole in a tableau of cruelty. A silence descended as heavy as a guillotine's blade. Then, in a voice so soft it belied the gravity of his words, Carter spoke, "You tied my sister to a pole for fun." The words, measured and dispassionate, reverberated around the room, each syllable a hammer blow. Greg's smirk vanished, replaced by a dawning horror, while Tyler's mouth fell silent, his eyes wide as they registered the impossibility of their crime. Carter's calm authority was chilling. "You humiliated her, mocked her, even took pictures," he continued, his tone unyielding. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until every whispered snicker and furtive glance was laid bare before him. "I bet you still have that evidence on your phone," he challenged, a subtle menace underlying his calm command. Greg's fingers twitched over his device, a futile gesture in the face of moral collapse. "Delete it," Carter commanded, his voice neither raised nor timid, but imbued with a certainty that silenced any feeble protest. The officer's eyes darted about the room as if searching for an escape, but none came. Their earlier bravado now seemed grotesquely misplaced, a comedy turned tragedy. Within minutes, the atmosphere in the precinct had mutated into one of dread and inevitability. Carter's measured steps continued as he approached the duo, each step sealing their fate. "Every report, every stop, every complaint, you'll be subject to a full review. This department will be held accountable," he stated, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. The revelation that the victim was not a nameless stranger but his own flesh and blood rendered their excuses feeble and their jokes monstrous. The fallout was swift and relentless. By midday, the image of a black woman, tethered to a pole by officers who had laughed in its wake, had ignited a conflagration of public outrage. Headlines flashed and social media erupted with disbelief. Civil rights organizations, outraged community members, and even the mayor demanded answers. Tanya, the woman whose dignity had been so callously violated, found herself thrust into the glare of public scrutiny. With a quiet determination, she recounted every harrowing detail, the mocking stares, the cruel photographs, the moments of unbearable isolation. Her voice, though trembling with pain, carried the weight of truth that resonated far beyond the precinct walls. Within the precinct itself, a new energy began to simmer, a mix of remorse and quiet dread. Officers who had once shared in the derision now avoided eye contact, whispering about long-ignored cases of abuse that had been swept under layers of bureaucracy. Carter's announcement of an audit into past complaints sent tremors through the department. Years of misconduct, hidden and tolerated, were suddenly coming under the unforgiving light of accountability. At the courthouse, beneath the harsh glare of flashbulbs and the probing questions of reporters, Tanya stood resolute. Microphones jostled for her attention as she addressed the gathered crowd with a steady, measured voice. "This isn't just about me, it's about every person who's ever been humiliated, mistreated, or violated by those sworn to protect us." Her words, powerful and raw, rippled through the room, drawing nods and quiet tears from those who had once feared to speak out. Back at the station, Carter retreated to his office, a sanctum of files and forgotten grievances. The dim lamplight revealed stacks upon stacks of complaints, each one a silent testament to a culture long steeped in abuse and indifference. He sat for a long time, eyes fixed on the papers, knowing that this incident with Greg and Tyler was merely the beginning of a much larger reckoning. His mind churned with the enormity of the task ahead, not only to punish two offenders but to dismantle a system that had allowed such cruelty to fester for far too long. Just before midnight, a quiet ring broke through the silence of his office. It was a call from Tanya. Her voice, gentle yet resolute, asked, "You good?" There was a moment, a brief pause, where the weight of the day's events seemed to hang between them. Carter, rubbing his tired jaw, replied in a low, honest tone, "I don't know." They both laughed softly, a fragile, bittersweet sound amid the chaos. "You really shook things up," Tanya observed, her voice laced with both admiration and sorrow. "Yeah," he admitted, "but it's not enough." In that brief exchange, the promise of change was forged, a recognition that though the battle was far from over, every step forward was a victory. In the aftermath of that turbulent night, as the city's pulse quickened with protest and the police department reeled from the shock of accountability, one truth emerged with crystalline clarity: injustice thrives in silence, and only by speaking up can the cycle be broken. Carter's words echoed in the corridors of power and in the hearts of those who had suffered too long. If you believe in justice, don't wait for the world to change, be the change. It was a call to arms, a quiet revolution that began with the courage to demand that every human being be treated with dignity. Thus, what had started as a cruel prank, a moment of callous laughter in the dead of night, transformed into a catalyst for systemic change. Greg and Tyler's names would soon be synonymous with disgrace, their careers ruined, their actions subject to the full force of the law. But more importantly, their transgression had shattered the complacency that once shielded an entire institution. The repercussions rippled outward, emboldening other officers to share long-silenced stories of abuse and igniting a public outcry that refused to be quelled. As the days turned to weeks, investigations deepened and more hidden injustices emerged from the shadows. The station, once a bastion of unchallenged authority, now hummed with nervous energy as internal reviews and external pressures forced every corner of its culture into scrutiny. Tanya, her voice now a rallying cry, stood at the front of community meetings and press conferences, her measured words forging a path for others to follow. "This is not about one night," she declared to an audience of weary yet hopeful faces. "It's about every moment where power was abused and every time someone was silenced. We must hold them accountable." Detective Carter, still immersed in the mountain of files on his desk, took solace in the small victories that were slowly emerging. Every complaint reopened, every officer held to account, was a testament to the resilience of those who refused to be marginalized. And though the system's inertia was formidable, the relentless pressure for reform was undeniable, a force that promised to reshape the future of law enforcement in that city and beyond. That night, as Carter finally closed his office door and the corridor's lights dimmed one by one, he paused for a moment. In the quiet, reflective solitude of the empty hall, he whispered to himself, "Power isn't just about wearing a badge, it's about what you do with it." And tonight, we began to use it for real justice. Outside, the city murmured with the hopeful buzz of change, a change born from the courage to confront darkness, to stand up when it would have been easier to remain silent. In the end, the lesson was stark and unyielding: when authority is wielded without conscience, it robs the innocent of their dignity and humanity. But when that same authority is challenged by the unbreakable spirit of truth, even the mightiest structures begin to crumble. And so, with every voice raised in protest and every quiet act of resistance, the promise of a fairer world glowed faintly in the distance, a light that, though small at first, could one day banish the longest of nights. The night of reckoning had come and gone, but its echo would live on in every whispered story, every act of defiance, and every time someone chose to stand up for what was right. In that echo, the future was being rewritten, one honest word at a time.